Hello, welcome to the Moxie Marine YouTube channel. In this video, I'm rebuilding a Mercruiser 3.0 4-cylinder engine, and I've already got 2 pistons installed so far in this remachined block. But I was about to install piston number 3, and I noticed something. So as I was taking this piston apart, this is right out of the engine. It's been cleaned a little bit, but not too much. I'm fixing to clean it again. And I'm also cleaning all my tools, apparently. So as I was taking this apart, I noticed that this bearing looked a little bit narrow. And I know that they make 2 different sizes of bearings for these 3 Mercruiser 3.0 engines. This particular bearing is is aluminum bearing, and you can tell by the kind of the shine it leaves in there. And there's really, the factory's aluminum bearings, there's really not a whole lot wrong with them, but I personally prefer to use what's called tri-metal, which is to me, a bearing that can handle better loads. It can handle higher loads better than the aluminum bearings. So, but that's not all what I discovered. So, if you notice the bearing, I thought it looked a little bit narrow. I didn't think it should be that narrow. So I got the bearing out, the brand new bearings that I'm putting back in. And what I found is, so I'll give a good picture of it. You can see that these new bearings are wider. And this crank and these rods will handle this wider bearing. So why didn't they put these wider bearings in the first place? So whoever rebuilt this before, and by the way, these bearings were standard. So if it was rebuilt, it was a mild rebuild. Didn't need major work. But so what I discovered is these are the newer, narrow bearings, and these are the older, wider bearings. And as I explained in another video called title is your 3.0 going to blow? You want to use the wider bearing whenever you can. So then this particular rebuild, I'm putting in the wider bearings, and the customer's going to gain from that. I hadn't even realized that until I just started to pull this bearing out. This is the old bearing. It's not worn out, obviously, but this engine had a blown head gasket, and that's why it had to be taken apart. And so, as you can see, this engine's going to be improved because it's going to have the wider bearings. So it's a better bearing than the bearing you see here in this picture. So I'm about to take this bearing out and reassemble this with the wider bearings. And like I say, the customer is going to benefit from this, and it'll make it a stouter engine. So thanks for watching, and I'll put a link to the other video I referred to as your 3.0 going to blow, where I discussed the narrow bearings and the older bearing, or the narrow bearings and the narrow bearings are newer, the older bearings are wider. And like I said, I'm putting the older style bearings in this engine. All right, if you've been following this video so far, what I've done is I put this 3-liter Mercruiser engine together, and I discovered that I can use wide bearings in these rods. And so based on the fact that they look like they would fit, and so I used the wide bearings, and I've completed putting all the pistons in this engine and putting the rod bearings on. Well, in doing so, I violated 3 of my cardinal rules. The first one being is I try to be methodical and go slow and do things, do it right and just pay attention to what I'm doing. I didn't do that this time. I saw the wide rod bearing. It looked like it would fit the rod, and just based on visual, my eyesight alone. And also I got caught in the trap of I'd done it before, so I just assumed I could do it again. And so that's the first thing I did wrong. The second thing is I wasn't very meticulous. I try to be methodical, meticulous, perfectionist, anal, whatever word you want to use. I wasn't very meticulous what I was doing. I didn't pay attention. I just basically slapped this engine together, ran with the wide bearings, and put it together. And the third cardinal rule I violated, and what the worst one of all, is I just did a video on this just a few weeks ago about don't let the force be with you. And basically what I was saying is that don't force things if they don't fit, or things don't feel right. Don't just ignore that and push it together, or pull it together with bolts. Or if something doesn't feel right and it's not seeming to go right, stop what you're doing, investigate, and find out why. Don't just force it. So in this particular engine, by the time I got to the 4th cylinder and I was trying to rotate it, after I got all 4 bearing rod caps on, and I was trying to rotate this engine, it was extremely difficult to turn. I mean, it was really, really tough to turn. I'd probably say I was putting 60 foot-pounds or so on the front of this crank to turn it. and that's a problem. You shouldn't have to take that much torque to turn this engine. And the second thing I did was, when I was pulling these rods up, I'd get the piston in, push it down as far as I go, flipped it over, and then when I was pulling these rods up, they just didn't feel like they wanted to come all the way up and touch the crank. They were just a little bit off. They felt like, it just felt like they weren't, a lot of times they'll just kind of like pop in place and just kind of knock the crank. Not really bad, but just a little of a, kind of like a knock sound. And they weren't doing that. They were just they were kind of just coming up to the crank, but not quite getting there. And so I just thought it was, I don't really know what I thought. I just ignored it. It was so close, I didn't think it was a big deal. So I put the bearings on here, and by the way, I said I was going to buy new bearings for this engine anyway, so I was going to go and put it together and then take it back apart and redo the bearings. I was going to do it anyway, so I never did plastic gauge anything. I did plastic gauge the first one, and the clearance was almost 0.003. The tolerance on these is 0.0027, and I think I had 0.0029 or 0.003 on the first one, so I decided I was going to replace the bearings anyway and go ahead and put the pistons in. But again, it just didn't feel right. So if you look real carefully right in here, let me show it to you. Right down through there. Look right here, right down, right in there. What's happening is that rod is too wide, or that rod bearing is too wide, and it's riding up inside that fillet right there. See how the crank is curved as it comes up to this surface right here with my fingernail? That bearing is riding just into that curve right there, into that fillet. And basically what that's doing is causing the bearing to be tight, and it's binding on the crank. And that's what was keeping it from coming up all the way, and it's what was making this crank hard to turn. So that's a case where I just assumed it worked and didn't pay attention to anything. I didn't even look at this and just put it together and ran with it, and I made a mistake. So now that I made the mistake, I've taken two of them back apart, and that's how I found it. I took this one apart and was looking at it, and then I looked down in there, saw that the bearing was riding in the fillet, and realized that's what was wrong. So again, I got caught in the fact that I've done this before, but apparently it looks to me like maybe the rods accept the wide bearing. Well, let me show you. Here's a rod cap. So that's the rod cap. This is a narrow bearing, by the way, but the wide bearing will fit in this cap, and the rod fits in the crank, but the crank is not cut for the wide bearing. It's only cut for the narrow bearing. So this particular engine, I'm going to have to go back and use the narrow bearing. And that's what I did. I went back and took this one apart, put the narrow bearing back in, put a narrow bearing here, put the rod on it, checked it with plastic gauge, and now I've got clearance of about 0.0022, somewhere in that range. So the fact that the rod was kind of jamming up against the fillet kept the rod from seating all the way, which made my clearance too big too. So it was affecting my plastic gauge reading as well. So using the narrow bearings, I get my clearances back into the proper range. So I'm going to rebuild this. I'm going to take these bearings back out and put the narrow bearings in like I should have from the start, and finish this motor. But I just wanted to highlight something, or explain that I do make mistakes quite a bit, I guess, but because I'm meticulous and go back and check myself, and just like I say, if I follow that cardinal rule, don't force things, and don't ignore things that don't feel right. A lot of times, 9 times out of 10, you're going to catch your mistakes. I want to discuss something else about these engines. These are 3-liter Mercruiser engines, and this particular engine, when I tore it down, it was probably one of the best internal condition engines I've come across. I really didn't even understand why it had to be rebuilt. I mean, it had a blown head gasket, but internally it was immaculate. Like I said, these are some of the bearings. These are the rod bearings that came out of it. These are what's called aluminum bearings, because you can tell by the shine of them. And you can look, if you look at it real carefully, you see it almost doesn't have any wear in it. So this is a bearing that came out of this engine when I had to rebuild it. I'll show you. Here's an example of this is the what's called the tri-metal bearing. I hadn't even taken the plastic edge off this one yet. You see it's more of a dull color, but of course that's the coating on it. But these just don't shine like the aluminum bearings. They're a three-part. They're made out of 3 different metals, and the aluminums are just, I think, just either 1 or 2 metal bearings. So, but the bottom line is that engines like this, from what I can tell, they seem to blow head gaskets for 2 reasons. One is the service manual says you're supposed to have the head bolts retorqued after 20 hours of use. The first 20 hours of use, you're supposed to retorque the head gasket or the head bolts on these engines. I don't know of anybody doing that. I haven't had any so far. I haven't had any of my customers call me up and say, "Hey, I need to bring that boat back to you and let you torque the head bolts." I've told them I'd do it for free, no charge, but nobody's called me. As a matter of fact, I probably should reach out to them and say, "Hey, you know, one, have you drained your boat, because it's about to be cold as crap this weekend, and 2, you need to bring the boat back to me and let me torque the head bolts again." That's one reason, not retorquing the head bolts. And 2, I think people are probably using too low octane gas. The service manual, I think, calls for 89 minimum. Personally, in these narrow bearing 3-liter engines, I'd run premium gas in these engines. I wouldn't take a chance on running anything less than 91 octane. So because these engines run at high speed, and when they're revving real high and make a lot of noise, you can't hear the knock. It's inaudible, or it's there, but you can't hear it because of the other engine noises drowning it out. So it's probably knocking with low octane gas. You won't hear it, and your motor just hammer itself to death. And eventually, it's either going to blow a head gasket, or it's going to destroy the bearings, or break something, sling a rod out the side. I had one in other videos where I show a hole inside the block, size of a baseball, where the rod came apart. And the rod came apart because the bearing overheated. Bearing went bad. The journal and the rod overheated, and the rod broke, and it went through the side of the block. So that's it for this. Again, I do make mistakes, and hopefully, or I'm glad to report that I usually find my mistakes and correct them before I give the engine back to the customer. And this is one of those cases. So hope this video helped you out. And I don't mind showing you my mistakes. I probably should show you more of them, because my thinking is that if I'm making mistakes, and then you should learn from my mistakes. You shouldn't make the same mistakes I do. So you're not going to get any benefit if I just cover up my mistakes and don't tell you about them. So this is one of the mistakes I've made, and glad I caught it. And again, I caught it because I first ignored my cardinal rule, but in the end, I went with my gut instinct and took this thing back apart and found the problem. Of course, I created the problem by making an assumption to begin with. When I saw that bearing, that wide bearing, and just assumed it would fit, I should have laid it against the crank, and probably would have seen that, okay, it won't fit between these 2 fillets, and so it can't use it. That's what I should have done. Okay, before I end this video, I wanted to backtrack and cover a couple things. Some of you might be wondering, well, if the head gasket was all that was wrong with this engine, why did I rebuild it? And when I first took this thing apart, that was my question too. I had torn it down, not finding hardly anything wrong with it. All the bearings in great shape, even the main bearings, rod bearings, was all great shape. And I thought, well, dang, I've done a lot of work taking this thing out, taking it apart, and all I probably needed was the head gasket to be replaced. But just to be careful, and like I say, being meticulous that I am, I went ahead and I did not take this crank back to the machine shop. I didn't send the crank to the machine shop to be turned, because it looked like it was in great shape, and I mic'd it, and it was. So there's no need. If a crank has very good journals, and it mics within the factory tolerance, there's no need to have it worked on. You can just rerun it, put new bearings in it, and go with it. But I also had the block, and so I was going to not take the block to the machine shop either. I was just going to hone the cylinders and rerun it. But I took my dial bore gauge and I checked the cylinders, 4, 3, 2, and they were all fine. They weren't worn out. They were fine. But I got to number 1, and it was 6 thousandths clearance on that cylinder, and that's way beyond the tolerance that you can run. So whoever built this engine before put number 1 at too big a clearance. I don't think it had anything to do with the head gasket blowing, but it sure probably rattled some. But that's why I ended up being justified in rebuilding this engine. Number 6 was way out of tolerance. So I had to go ahead and have the block bored. I had all these bores bored 30 over to clear up that problem. So it did need rebuilding after all, but you couldn't tell it from looking at it on the teardown. I had to actually measure things to find out that it was out of tolerance on number one. So that's why I rebuilt this engine, just in case anybody had a question. Another thing is, like I said, I'm going to rebuild this engine, put the narrow bearings back in, and I've already plastic gauged that one, and it came out to like 0.0022, which is fine. The factory tolerances, production tolerance is 0.0027. So that I'm pretty sure the rest of them will plastic gauge out good too. So I'm going to use the narrow bearings. They're standard stock narrow bearings. However, if they did not fit, if the clearance was 3,000 inch, which is out of tolerance, you can buy bearings that are 0.001 inch smaller than stock. So that helps to save a crank. If your crank's just a little bit worn, you can buy these bearings to make up the slack and get your clearances within tolerance again. Here's the problem. This is a 3 liter. Like I'm using narrow bearings. They don't make the narrow bearings with a 0.001 smaller. They make the wide bearings. By the way, these wide bearings are the same bearings used in a small block Chevrolet and an LS motor. LS motors and small blocks share the same rod bearing, and apparently the 3 liter Mercruisers do too. So you can't get the narrow bearings in a 0.001. So if I had to take up the slack, if the plastic gauge did not show me these bearings were within tolerance and I needed to use the 0.001s to get it in tolerance, what I'd planned to do was take a factory bearing, and you see where my thumb is at, I was going to shave the edge of it. You can see where I've already started doing it. I was going to do that with these. And so I was starting the process of shaving the edge of this bearing off to fit within that fillet right there. But I checked the top, when I shaved this one and put it back in there and checked my clearance with plastic gauge, and it was still too big. So I was going to have to shave it some more. And I said, you know what? If by the time I finish shaving these, I'm going to cut away half the wide bearing anyway. I might as well put the narrow ones in there and see if the plastic gauge will work. And it did, so I decided to go back. That's why I decided to go back with the narrow bearings. But in case you ever do need to save a 3 liter crank and you want to use a wide bearing, you can shave the edge of it. I would probably, if I had to do this again, I'd probably use a Dremel tool with some kind of metal cutting bit on it, and just grind away the edge of these bearings to make them narrower. I was using a tool. I find out where it did work. I was using a deburring tool. This is a deburring tool I bought from Lowe's. It's got a curved blade, and it's what you use to take sharp edges off of metal. The curved blade helps you stay on the edge, and this is used to deburr sharp edges on cut holes and stuff. So I was shaving that bearing with this tool, and I was shaving the crap out of it, and I still couldn't get the tolerance, get it to the right tolerance. So I decided to go back to the narrow bearing, because by the time I shaved it, I was going to be close to the narrow bearing anyway, and that was going to be a lot of extra work. So I'm going to go ahead and build this back with the narrow bearing. So there's just a couple things I wanted to point out as part of this process of me trying to figure out what to do with this engine. But ultimately, like I say, I'm going to go back with the narrow bearing, and that probably solved my problem. So thanks for watching, and subscribe if you haven't already, and good night.